Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marissa DeMaya, and I am with the Southwest ADA Center here in Houston, Texas. Very quickly, we're one of 10 centers across the United States that is federally funded, that's your tax dollars at work, to provide you with ADA technical assistance, answer questions, and information. I want to give a very quick shout out to our hosts for today, and that is the DD Council, or Developmental Disabilities Council of Oklahoma. They're really the main reason why we are here today. They put this whole thing together. So we want to thank them, especially Jennifer Randall, for helping us put all this together. We also want to thank the Oklahoma Department of Rehab Services, also for hosting this event with us and providing the interpretation and other communication services as well. Without further ado, again, thank you to both of those organizations for serving as our host for today. I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Jones and Diego DeMaya. Debbie?
Thank you, Marissa. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Debbie Jones. I am an ADA information specialist with the Southwest ADA Center. I have been a part of SWATA for almost 2 years now, just short of maybe a couple of weeks. And before I joined SWATA, I spent 20 years in higher education at a private university as a mental health counselor and a disability services provider to students. And I am joined today by my colleague, Diego DeMaya.
Hello out there, and thank you for having us here. And this is Diego DeMaya, and I am an attorney, and I specialize in employment, law, education, and I guess, all things having to do with being an ADA nerd. So hopefully we'll be able to keep you entertained and talk about service animals and emotional support animals, and hopefully you guys will have lots of questions for us. We're looking forward to that, and thank you for having us along here. And definitely a shout out to all of the people joining us from all the different towns. I'm amazed at all these different locations. Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. We know that some of this information is going to raise questions for you, and we do have time at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and Marissa will be monitoring those, and we hope to get to them when we're done with our slideshow. Okay, so now on to
I forgot about that.
Well, we do want to answer people's questions because we know that that's going to be really important. All right, so now on to let's talk service animals and emotional support animals. The other way. Okay. So here's what we're going to be discussing today. The first thing that I want to do is give a good definition of what are service animals and what are emotional support animals, because I think that there's a lot of confusion. I think that these definitions can feel a little fuzzy for people. So we want to define what they are. So then we're going to talk about the laws that cover these animals. The ADA is divided into sections, and the sections are called titles. So we're going to talk about 3 of the titles of the ADA. First, we're going to talk about Titles 2 and Titles 3, which cover public entities and public accommodations, and we will define what those are. And then we're going to talk about the 2 questions, which are really important when we're talking about service animals. And also, when can a service animal be excluded? That's a question that a lot of people have had. What does it mean for a service animal to be under the handler's control? What about certification for these animals? And then other important provisions. Then we're going to talk about the employment section of the ADA, which is Title 1, and how that relates to service animals. And there's going to be a mention about emotional support animals there as well. Then we'll talk about the Air Carriers Access Act, which has to do with flying on a plane. We'll make some tips and recommendations, and then of course we'll have some resources for you all to have a look at. Okay, so let's define a service animal. 99% of the time, I would say, a service animal is going to be a dog. In very rare circumstances, you may run into a miniature horse that has been trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. I have not personally ever seen a miniature horse. I think they are very rare. So by and large, what we're talking about are dogs and no other kind of animal. The tasks that the dog, maybe the horse, has been trained to do have to be directly related to the person's disability. Anything you want to add to that, Diego? Have you ever seen a miniature horse as a service animal?
No, only just that if people are curious about, what a miniature horse is, you can actually look it up on YouTube. It's really fascinating to see an actual miniature horse. It looks like something out of prehistoric times. I mean, because they're very, very tiny, and they look like a horse. And so it's fascinating to know that they really are out there, and some people do breed them professionally to behave like, and train them like service animals. But if you have any specific questions about, miniature dogs and why they were included, you're welcome to ask us a questions. We're not going to spend too much time on that. But like Debbie said, 99% of the time we're dealing with dogs which serve as service animals.
I hope at one point in my life I run into a miniature horse service animal. I think that would be awesome. Okay, so some examples of tasks that dogs can be trained to do for folks, and there is a photo of a pretty classic looking golden retriever. That's kind of what everybody thinks of when they think of service dogs, is a golden retriever, but there actually isn't a stipulation that they be a particular breed of dog. But this dog is handing a can to a lady who's using a wheelchair. So some tasks that dogs can be trained to do, it would be to pull a wheelchair for a person, guide a person who is blind or has a visual disability, alerting or providing cues to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, reminding a person to take medications. I have seen a dog go into a person's backpack and pull out a bottle of pills and hand it to the individual. That was pretty cool. They may be able to detect the onset of low blood sugar or whether a seizure may be coming on. Detecting the onset of a panic episode could be something that they learn based on the individual's body language. Or they may also be trained to walk ahead of a person who has PTSD to have a look around the venue to be sure that it would feel safe to them. And then they kind of go back and reassure the individual that this would be an okay place for them to come to. So now we're going to talk about emotional support animals, or ESAs. This can be any kind of animal. There's no limitation as to what type of animal an ESA may be. And this animal provides emotional support, which can help with the symptoms of a person's disability. And it's generally speaking a mental health disability. This is an emotional support animal. They provide companionship, relieve loneliness, and sometimes help with depression, anxiety, and some phobias, but they don't have any particular training to perform tasks the way a service animal would. As a result, they are not afforded the same right of access as service dogs under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is important, that ESAs don't have the same right of access as service animals. They are recognized under the Fair Housing Act. And we will talk some more about the Fair Housing Act in a bit and how the Fair Housing Act considers ESAs and service dogs. Did you want to add anything here, Diego?
No, you're doing great. Go ahead.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another important point that a lot of folks don't realize. Animals, whether they are service animals or emotional support animals, do not have to have any kind of ID. They don't have to wear a vest. They do not have to wear a specific service dog harness of a particular color. They don't need any kind of identification under the law. And there is no such thing as a legitimate service animal or emotional support animal certification, quote unquote, or registry anywhere in the US. And I want to insert something here. I have noticed recently, I admit that every so often I will turn on YouTube and I will watch some kind of video to, spend a little time. And a lot of times ads will break into a YouTube video. Well, here lately, I have seen a whole rash of ads talking about some registry or certification for emotional support animals that if you call them or email them and give them money, they will provide you with just the information you need so that you can take your animal anywhere you want. Well, both Diego and I are here to tell you that this is not legitimate. This is bogus, and people
Yep.
have spent a huge amount of information, a huge amount of money, because they feel like these people are telling them something that is true, and it is not.
I've seen fees of $500 to get an ID card. Yeah.
Yeah,
Giving,
it's a shame.
yeah, giving people permission supposedly to take their service animal wherever they go. And regrettably, folks, it's a scam. It's basically just a way to get money from people. So please be careful. When you see these things out there, there are no federal agencies that will register animals. There are no state agencies that will register federal animals, right, Debbie? There's
Right.
no official entity out there that will do that. So if anybody tells you otherwise, it's not true. And if you have any doubts, always give us a call. Go ahead, Debbie.
Let me also circle back to an animal wearing a harness or a vest, a service animal wearing a harness or a vest. They are not required under the ADA. However, there are circumstances that people will go into where it can be helpful. So we won't ever tell somebody that they can't put a harness or a vest or a special leash on a dog to identify it as a service animal. Particularly if you've got a small kind of dog or some dog that isn't like that golden retriever that might automatically be recognized by a lot of people as a service dog. Sometimes it is helpful to have a vest or a harness on, but like we said, it is not completely necessary. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the titles of the ADA. So Title II has to do with public entities. Public entities are any state or local government, any department, agency, special purpose district, or other instrumentality of a state or a local government. They are also transportation related industries. So it could be flying on a plane, traveling on a train, other public transportation. The Department of Transportation, which is over these entities, has guidelines that differ slightly in their allowances of service animals and ESAs, and we will talk about that later. Okay, so state and local government sponsored programs, events, or venues are all covered under Title II of the ADA. Service animals are allowed at events and locations where programs are held, including courtrooms, city hall, public works, city and county buildings where you may go for like a city council meeting or a town hall session, libraries, public pools, and programs, events that are sponsored through a county or city entity like the YMCA or day camps, something like that. And let me go back to public pools. Yes, a service animal is allowed to come to a public pool, but not swim in a public pool, right, Diego? They can't get into the water.
That's correct. Yeah. They just
Yeah,
can't get into the water, but definitely be, like around the pool deck where everybody
right.
sits.
Okay. So schools, public and charter schools, so we're saying K through 12, these institutions are generally covered under Title II. Service dogs have to be allowed in these institutions not only under Title II of the ADA, but also under the Individuals with Disabilities Act, which people know as IDEA, as well as the Free Appropriate Public Education, FAPE section, which is under IDEA. Post-secondary institutions, so that's higher education, colleges and universities, would also be covered under Title II if they receive federal funds. And I will say that probably most institutions of higher education, most colleges and universities do receive federal funds if they offer any kind of student loans that are federally funded.
Yeah, and that would include Title III covered institutions, like private colleges, universities that get federal funding. Also, they would be covered by the Rehabilitation Act, as well
Correct.
as Title III of the ADA. Yeah.
Right. And that's a good segue because now we're up to examples of Title III from the ADA, which is about public accommodations. These are, commonly regarded places where people go, like restaurants, bars, bakeries, cafes, movie theaters, retail establishments, hotels and motels, banks, gas stations, dry cleaners, hair salons, gyms, bowling alleys, sports venues, zoos, museums, and amusement parks. All of these bullet points are required to allow service animals. Okay, so now we're coming into the Fair Housing Act, which is a different law. This was a joint effort, the creation of this law, a joint effort between the Department of Justice and HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the FHA dovetails in many ways with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is the legislation that makes it illegal to discriminate against persons with disabilities in housing settings. People with disabilities have the right under the Fair Housing Act to have their service animal or their emotional support animal with them in their dwelling. Okay, so now we're coming to what happens when someone brings a service animal into a public setting. Can someone ask questions to find out whether this is actually a service animal or might it be someone's pet or someone's emotional support animal? So as we've said, service animals have the right to access in all those entities that we talked about, but emotional support animals do not. Emotional support animals are covered under the Fair Housing Act. Okay, so there are two questions that are completely legitimate for someone to ask when an individual has come in with a dog. So the first question is this animal required because of a disability? Do you need this dog because of a disability? Now, you're not allowed to ask, what is your diagnosis? What is your disability? And really, if the person has come in with a mobility device or with a cane, some outward evidence that they do have a disability, there really isn't any reason to even ask this question. So the assumption is that you can't tell when a person walks in with a dog whether this is a service animal or not. And so you can say, do you need this dog because of a disability? And if the answer is yes, then you can ask, what work or task does the animal perform? And they really do need to give you an answer of a job that this animal has been trained to do that is specifically related to that person's disability. So I had asked a lady who was on the phone with me. She was talking about a small chihuahua that she had, and she was describing it as a service animal. And I said, well, tell me what task your dog has been trained to do. And the lady said, well, he licks my face when I'm sad. Well, I had to break it to her that that's the kind of thing that anybody's pet will do pretty much. That's an emotional support animal. That is not a trained task that that dog provides. And she really didn't have an answer as to, having trained her dog to do any specific task. So that was an indication at that point that we were talking about an emotional support animal. In a public setting, if someone gives an answer like that, if they cannot say that this dog has been trained to do a specific task, that dog may be asked to leave. They may be asked to leave. It is important, though, to not exclude the individual. An individual with a disability is always welcome to participate, to join in, whatever the venue is, whatever the event is, but they may be asked to take the dog out because the dog isn't appropriate at that point. So when might a service animal be asked to leave a public setting? So, well, I just described it. It's not actually, well, no, that's not true. I just described an animal that's not a service animal. So let's say they did answer correct questions. They do have an animal that's been trained to do a specific task. But if the animal is not behaving in the way that we expect a service animal to behave, it is okay to say that animal needs to leave. You need to take the animal out. If it is disruptive, out of control, and the handler is not able to get it under control. Also, if the animal is not housebroken or presents a health hazard because it's dirty, it hasn't been cared for. And as I said here, as this little asterisk here, the person should always be given the opportunity to participate without the animal. So please take your animal out. If someone else can take your animal, you are welcome to come back. If you get some more training for your animal, and if your animal can come back at another time and behave the way we expect it to, you would be welcome to come back. So if a person identifies the animal as a service animal, that doesn't mean that a location, a venue, or other people have to tolerate bad behavior on the part of the animal.
Debbie,
Yes.
this is Marissa.
Hi.
Sorry to interrupt. We did have a question that came up that may be related to this in a transportation setting. I know we're going to go over the Air Carrier Access Act later on, but they're asking if there's concerns, for example, somebody's on a public transportation mode like a bus or maybe a train. If there's concerns from others about a service animal, how should that be handled?
Well, I guess that depends. If the service animal looks like the photo of this snarling dog, then they have legitimate concerns, and they should report to the bus driver or someone who is in charge. And that person would have the ability to exclude that animal, to stop the bus. I don't know about a train. It might be a little hard to stop a train, but maybe sequester the animal someplace that it wouldn't be a disruption to others. If people are not sure, they feel a little uneasy around a dog, or someone may even say they have some allergies related to animals and they don't want to be by that animal, it's not as cut and dried. They have a right to be there too, but the animal has a right to be there if it is behaving itself. Service animals are, almost a device to help the person with a disability, and so you wouldn't take someone's wheelchair away. You wouldn't take a walker away. You can't just take the animal away because, you don't want to be around an animal. So it may be that that individual may need to relocate themselves.
Thanks.
Debbie,
Anything?
yeah, I just wanted to add, um, we get a lot of questions about this. I wanted folks to know that we get a lot of questions about what happens, in the field when they're traveling on a bus or a cab, any of that. And what's really important to keep in mind is that the one thing that's important to keep in mind is also that the animal handler, right, the owner of the service animal, they are entirely obligated to mind, where they are taking their dog, where they are taking their service animal with them, because in reality, there may be places and locations where you just can't go there with a dog. I'm talking about really crowded situations, I'm talking about, if you ride a bus line, for example, that is known for getting really crowded and the buses have standing room only and they get really crowded, it's very difficult to travel with a service animal. Although the bus driver is supposed to technically unseat someone sitting in the front disability access seats in the front of the bus and allow someone who has a walker or a cane or even a service animal to sit in the front seat. So there are certain privileges and benefits that are not mentioned in the ADA law necessarily, but that are more relating to a disability, service animal disability etiquette is kind of what we call it. And there's many, many rules about that. So we could go on and on forever talking about disability etiquette and service animals. But the main point is that the environments, in where we go are really important. And we always encourage people who have service animals to please, to be cognizant, of where they're going, and what their expectations are, because the ADA cannot prevent everybody from discriminating. The ADA does not reach into the mindsets of people and their prejudices. I'll give you one last example. We get questions about restaurants and people who come in with a service animal. Their service animal is legitimate after the two questions were asked. And they take a table and they say, and they're going to have, dinner and whatnot. And then somebody comes in and says, oh, I'm really afraid of dogs and I don't want to be anywhere near a dog, And the Department of Justice was asked, well, what do we do in that situation? Because a person who has like a dog phobia and they're really scared of dogs, they might have a legitimate reason to be afraid. It's a condition they have or it's a fear they have. And nobody wants to diminish that. But basically the recommendation ends up being that the restaurant has to make an effort to seat those two people in very different locations throughout the restaurant, if possible, right? Far away from each other, like at one end and then the other end, for example. So when we're talking about, traveling on buses and cabs and everything else, again, we're looking at the environment and what is reasonably possible to accommodate a service animal. So, and yeah, service animals have to be allowed. We know that the law says so, but we have to look at all the different issues, and we always encourage owners to be very cognizant about where they go and how they participate.
Good, thanks.
Thank you both.
Okay, so service dogs do need to be harnessed or on a leash or, somehow tethered. There are two exceptions. So if for some reason the individual is unable to use a leash because of their disability or because it would interfere with the performance of a particular task. So I think I mentioned earlier, there are dogs that have been trained to help folks that have a PTSD diagnosis, people who need to be assured that wherever they go is going to feel safe because they just have these triggers that need to be accounted for. So a dog will walk ahead of them. They've been trained. It's really cool that they train this. They take the dog off the leash, and the dog will go ahead of them and scan the room, scan the venue, look down the way, and be sure that there isn't some disruptive activity happening that would upset their handler. And then once they have, scoped the place out, they will return to the handler, and the handler generally at that point will put the leash back on them. And that is their trained task. So for the time that the dog is performing that task, they are off leash, and that is okay. The animal, even when it is off leash, still must be under the handler's control. So the handler uses a voice command or hand signal or some other effective means. So an animal just can't be, running around doing whatever they want. They have to be well controlled no matter what.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, Debbie, that along with what we said earlier, also along these lines that you're saying now, when please keep in mind that if the animal misbehaves, starts barking, and the owner cannot take control over it, the animal starts misbehaving or is cut loose and it's playing with people or pursuing people. We get that from a lot of hotels who describe that kind of a situation sometimes where the dog is just running around loose, sniffing after customers who come in and out. And well, at that point, a legitimate service animal will be excluded. It'll be legal for them to ask the owner to please remove the service animal from the premises if they are unable to gain control over it.
Right, thank you. So here are a couple of photos on this slide about legitimate service animals doing exactly what they are supposed to do, and the handlers are doing what they have to do. So there's a photo of a boy sitting at a table in school, and he has a leash attached to a belt that he's wearing. And his good dog is under the table at his feet, very calmly just lying there waiting for him. The other picture is an individual in a wheelchair, and you can see that the animal is wearing a pack vest and has a leash attached to him, and then the individual has that leash around his forearm. So this animal they're both doing exactly what they're supposed to do and what we expect service animals to do. Now, these photos are not of animals not doing what they're supposed to do. They're cute. There are two pictures of little animals that have been put into the baskets of shopping carts. This is not where animals go. We also know that cats, there's a cat and a puppy in a shopping basket. We know that cats are not service animals. And I would venture that these two puppies that are in shopping baskets are not service animals because they're not old enough to have been trained to be service animals. So those two sets of photos, those animals could be excluded. The third photo is of a couple sitting at a table at a restaurant, and their dog is sitting up on the chair facing them across the table. Service dogs should not be sitting on chairs.
And there's your disability etiquette.
Yes. Well, and you had talked about, Diego, you talked about how bus drivers should allow them to sit at the front in the accessible seating. The dog doesn't get to sit on the seat. The dog should always be at the handler's feet.
Correct. Right. If anybody's interested, we do have materials that discuss disability etiquette, just to mention that.
We have lots of materials. Okay, so other provisions to know. You may train your own service animal under the law while your dog is learning the tasks and behaviors that we need service animals to learn. That dog is referred to as a service animal in training. Okay, it's not a fully fledged service animal. So it may very well be that those puppies that we were looking at a minute ago, they could be service animals in training, but they are too young and they have not been fully trained enough to be service animals. In many states, including Oklahoma, Texas too, which is where we are, they only allow access in public entities and public accommodations when when a service animal in training is accompanied by a professional trainer. So this is a little bit of a catch. You are entitled to train a dog yourself to be a service animal. However, unless you are a professional trainer yourself, you cannot bring your service animal in training into a public entity or a public accommodation. Covered entities are not responsible for the care or supervision of a service animal. Okay, so going into a restaurant or a city council meeting, no one else is responsible to take care of your service animal. Service animals can go anywhere that their handler is allowed to go, unless allowing the dog in would fundamentally alter the nature of a service or a program. So it could be that, in a hospital, there's a sterile environment or quarantine areas or a lab, someplace that might actually present a danger either to the animal or to the folks that are in that environment. Any fees or surcharges that may be related to pets, like in a hotel, cannot be placed on a service animal because service animals are not pets. However, if a service animal causes any damages, any physical damages, then the handler would be responsible to pay for that. So that's different from a fee. That would be covering damages. As I said a second ago, hotels and motels are covered under Title III as a public accommodation. So service animals must be allowed at a hotel or a motel. But emotional support animals can be excluded if a hotel or a motel has a no pet policy. There are plenty of hotels that do allow pets in, and then an emotional support animal would be regarded as a pet and can come along. But even if a hotel has a no pet policy, they have to allow a service animal, and they cannot charge extra for the service animal to be there. They can't charge extra to clean the room after a service animal has left. But like I said a minute ago, if the service animal causes any damage to a hotel room, then the handler would be liable for that. Service animals can go anywhere in a hotel except for possibly a kitchen, food preparation area, although of course they can go into the restaurant. Hospitals, this is another set of questions that we often get. Hospitals and medical facilities can fall under Title III public accommodations, but they also may fall under Title II if they're public entities. So it might be a county or a state hospital. Service animals have to be permitted to accompany a person in hospitals, whether that person is a patient or a visitor. Hospitals can decide to exclude a service animal if there's a sterile environment or someplace that they feel that it would be unhygienic or dangerous for a service animal to go. A hospital is not obligated or required to take care of the animal, like I said a minute ago. So it's possible there might be a circumstance where a patient is all by themselves in a hospital room, and when they're asleep, there is no one there to take care of the service animal. The hospital might ask that individual to have someone come and take the service animal. They might not have anybody there that could help with the service animal. In emergency evacuations, they have to make accommodations to allow for the service animal to go with the handler. I feel like if someone is getting into an ambulance, that most frequently they do allow a service animal to come in with the handler. Isn't that true, Diego? Did we lose you, Diego?
Diego, did we lose you?
Sorry, ask me again. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. So if someone gets into an ambulance
Yeah.
and they have a service animal, do they typically allow the service dog to hop into the ambulance with them?
Yes, this was a really big deal during the hurricane seasons and major storms that we've suffered across the country here in the past several years. And, voluminous numbers of questions related to what happens to the service animal of someone who gets taken away, like say, by an air, like a helicopter ambulance, for example, right? Very important. Basically, the Department of Justice came down really hard on this because a lot of dogs were being left behind literally on the street, which was a huge no-no, as you can imagine. I mean, that's basically like a crime to do that. And so Department of Justice basically said you will take the animal with you, even if it's a helicopter flight, even if it's an emergency ambulance or rescue vehicle, or those officials on the site will make arrangements to take the dog separately in a separate vehicle if that's necessary. So for example, if sterilization is necessary, right? Because oftentimes they have to do surgery on the vehicles, right? They have open wounds and things like that to deal with, then they will have to make arrangements. Someone would have to stand by with the dog until it can be taken to be reunited with its owner, or they identify the family members or a contact that the dog can be taken to. Ultimately, David, just kind of to fill in this whole, which is really kind of controversial. What happens to the service animals during medical emergencies or evacuation. Um, Ultimately, if no one can be found to take take a service animal, then they are supposed to turn it over to the appropriate authorities, like I forget what they're called, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and they would take the service animal and hold it there. And of course, the officials taking the dog there would get whatever documentation information they can get to be able to give that to the owner if they want to go and retrieve the dog. So we can get into that if they have any more questions about that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the third section of the ADA that we had mentioned. Actually, it's Title I, which has to do with employment and animals. And I think, Diego, you wanted to talk about Title I.
Okay. So Title I is employment, which Title I of the, Title I, big letter I of the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability for employees and job applicants with disabilities in the arena of employment. And essentially, service dogs has sort of become an item of contention and controversy because a lot of employers just quite frankly, don't want to see dogs at the office or in a warehouse type of environment. Or busy, work floors where people have to, hustle and bustle and move things around, and there can be dangers and risks and so forth to the dog. And so this has been going through the courts, believe it or not, as we speak. There's always some kind of a case pending in court about a service animal being requested to be present at somebody's workplace by an employee with a disability. So, in a nutshell, basically, without necessarily referring to the points on the slide in the order, a service animal can be granted as a reasonable accommodation in the workplace for the employee who has a disability. The requirement would be that the dog's function, right, the task or work that the dog performs in how it provides that assistance to the animal owner, the person with the disability, or the employee who has the disability, right? It those two things have to connect to the essential job functions that the person performs at work. I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible so people can understand. In other words, um, the dog's presence at work has to somehow improve the employee's ability to do their job at the work site. Okay. That's pretty much the bottom line of how a service animal would be allowed to remain at the office with an employee or to be present at the office with an employee. It has to help them perform, whatever their job duties are. Now, obviously, the dog is not going to do the job, right? That the person's being paid to do. But the idea is that the person, without the dog being there, would suffer a dysfunction. In other words, they would not be able to function and do their job because they need their support dog to be there. An example of this would be a seizure detection dog, a diabetes dog that can detect, low blood sugar levels, a psychiatric dog, such as those for people who have PTSD. And so those are the kinds of accommodations that people have been allowed to have their dogs with them. But I can tell you from experience that employers will push back on having dogs at the workplace. And the reason, many reasons, are really quite legitimate. A lot of them have to do with safety and risk to the dog, and I'll give an example of that shortly. Other reasons have to do with the fact that people at work will get distracted by the dog and they want to pet and play with the dog, and maybe the owner is not taking proper care of the dog. Maybe, like Debbie referred to it earlier, the dog might be dirty, they're not being kept clean, they smell bad. And so there can be all these other reasons where the dog might be excludable from the work site, for good reason. And so the owner, again, has to observe proper disability service animal etiquette, keep control of the dog at all times. They have to be with them, by their side. Um, I had a caller one time who told me that what he did is he had his PTS dog with him at the office, and he put like a baby, what are they called when you put those little corral things where you put children in them, like a little playpen, right?
Yeah, yeah, a
And
playpen.
yeah, and so what this guy did is he built kind of like a playpen around his office cubicle, and it's like a circle, so the dog is always inside there and doesn't come out until the owner takes it outside. So that was one way to keep his dog there without, so it wouldn't be roaming the office or go anyplace else. And that was kind of a solution that they allowed him to have. But um, a dog can be excluded for safety reasons. An example of that would be a major case that went to the courts. And basically, the court sided with the employer. In this case, it was a railroad company, a freight company. And this was an actual locomotive engineer who wanted to have his dog with him in the locomotive cab. And even both Debbie and I concurred on this, even though we don't drive trains for a living and we don't have any experience doing that. We guessed that there's no way that a dog could ever be in the cab of an engine, of a locomotive engine, if anything, because of the unusually high noise levels, which can be very hearing, damaging to human hearing, which, they force them to wear ear protection. And they said, no, the dog cannot be in that kind of an environment. That would just be way too dangerous for the dog. And so that was one, very drastic sort of, I guess, exaggerated example. But, there you go. Somebody actually took that to court because they wanted to know if that was something that they could do. Truck drivers have been known to have their service dogs with them. They've had to ask their trucking company for permission to do that as a reasonable accommodation. So in that case, that went to court, and the court said, yes, the truck driver, the dog wouldn't face too much of a safety issue or risk in being in the cab with the truck driver, because the truck driver has to observe certain protocols and safeties when they're driving a big rig on the road. And so they didn't see that that would be a distraction for the driver to cause some kind of a risk, or to pose a danger. So, and there might be some limitations to that, but um, in that case, it was permissible. But in terms of like typical work environments, call centers, office spaces, warehouses where people do manufacturing tasks, typically service animals would not be allowed. So that's kind of gives you like an overview of how that works. And did I miss anything on the slide, Debbie, that I should mention?
What about ESAs?
Oh yeah, ESAs. Thank you. So emotional support animals, because the Title I of the ADA does not define a service animal, right? Like Titles 2 and 3 do. Um, because there's no definition, basically what the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has done is said that ESA animals can be allowed as a reasonable accommodation so long as they allow the person to perform their essential job function. So there again, the emotional support animal must be performing some kind of a function, even though you really can't tell what the function would be and there's no training requirement, as Debbie said earlier. um, the psychological or psychiatric function, right? The mental health related support function that it performs has to be related in to the work being performed by the employee, and allow the employee to perform their job more confidently, to meet their job requirements, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people, for example, in call centers will have their ESA sitting there with them while they're making their phone calls, because the environment, allows for that to be acceptable as a reasonable accommodation. So there you have it. That's kind of the world of service animals, in employment. And again, this is a controversial area. There's no yes or no answer. It's going to be handled on an individualized case by case basis when an employee makes a request. And regrettably, there is a great deal of pushback by default by the human resources and environment, as well as by supervisors and bosses in jobs. And I think I'll stop there and see if we have any questions about employment.
Well, what I wanted to say is,
Yeah,
I think what is good about the ADA for Title I is that it not only recognizes that employees have rights, but it also recognizes that employers have rights, and they have the right to determine,
exactly.
what their workplace is going to look like, what will be appropriate.
That's
And it
right.
may very well be appropriate for someone to have their pet chinchilla in a cage on their desk if they've got a office door that they can close, and it makes a big difference for them. But an employer can also say, no, we're not, that's not going to be appropriate in our workplace. So I
Yeah.
think it's great that the ADA sees both sides.
I think I heard somebody asking a question about somebody being allergic. What if somebody's allergic to dogs at the office? And I'm going to mention that because that's kind of a very typical question that we've gotten with Debbie at the ADA Center.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, what happens there is that you look at the environment and you make a decision whether the two people can be separated enough or sequestered enough, so that that allergy problem can be somewhat eliminated. But just because someone has an allergy, that does not negate the ability of the person who needs the dog to have their dog there. So that would not be enough of a reason. And the person with the allergy to dogs would more than likely be asked to provide medical documentation, because at that point, that kind of an allergy is becoming, raising itself to the level of being an actual disability. And what they're doing is they're asking an accommodation to, to somehow be be separated or to somehow tell the other person that they cannot have their dog there present at the office. So again, this is going to be on a case-by-case basis. And there have been many cases where people have had allergies to dog hair and so forth. And yes, it has been a huge problem. And the way that they resolved it where they could, where it was reasonable and where it did not cause undue hardship, that's significant difficulty or expense or a disruption to the work environment. If it didn't cause that, they've been accommodated and people have been separated or given a separate space, a separate office, where it's possible. But if it does cause undue hardship, a disruption in the workplace, or a significant difficulty or expense, for instance, there aren't private offices available, right? Everybody works in a cubicle. Then they're going to have to figure out how they can do this, and they may come to the wire where they may have to decline the person's need for the service animal at work. In other words, they're going to have to make a decision and decide whether they want to have that liability of the person complaining or not, because there's, like I said, there's no easy answer. And so what they're more than likely going to do is try to accommodate the person with the allergy by providing air filters. They're going to provide masks. They're going to recommend all these different things. And I want people to know that there is a website that we send people to, which is known as the Job Accommodations Network. And they have a great wealth of publications relating to service animals at work and dealing with these issues, including allergies, people with dog phobias or anxieties. This has all been, treated. So I recommend that, going there. The website is askjan.org, and I think they're providing the website for that, Debbie. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay. The next slide is about the Air Carrier Access Act.
Okay, the Air Carrier Access Act. Yeah, so basically, a lot of controversy here, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. Essentially, no other type of animal other than ADA-defined service animals, dogs, only dogs, not miniature horses, but only dogs, will be allowed on an airplane, on a passenger airplane. I'm not necessarily going by the slide, but this is basically what the law is. And essentially, this is because of all the major headlines you can easily Google out there, and even YouTube videos of people bringing in their ducks, their chickens, their geese, their pet snakes, their hamsters, pigs. There've been some other exotic animals that have been brought on board. And basically, the Department of Justice said enough is enough. There's a lot of problems with exotic animals being brought on airplanes. Likewise, with exotic animals going into public places, which is why no other exotic animal is allowed in a public place. Like Debbie said, like in a concert venue, no cats, no birds, no snakes. The same thing for airplanes, just not allowed, only service dogs. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but that's basically pretty much it. We do recommend that when people travel with a service animal, that they contact the airline and follow their protocol to bring their service animal on board. And regrettably, we get too many calls from people who just show up at the airport and are usually told, no, you can't bring the dog on board. You didn't tell us about it. You didn't let us know. And while that might be in violation of the Air Carrier Access Act, right, they'll still miss the plane. They will still be delayed, and that plane will take off without them. And, I'm being practical in terms of the kinds of calls that we get, because people just keep doing that, regrettably, and they will be turned away, even if it violates the law. In other words, you can't just take him to court, in the next 10 minutes so you don't lose your flight, right? Nobody can do that. So we recommend always that people notify the airline that you're coming in with a service animal. And you will not be required to provide the documentation, but they will be asking the questions of if it's necessary because of a disability and what task the dog will perform. David, did I miss anything on that Air Carrier Access Act slides?
Well, let's see. We've got a second slide here. Let's see. You said this already. No other species other than dogs.
Right? No ESAs.
No,
No.
and that's new. That's
Yeah,
new.
that's new.
As
That's
of
very new.
January 2021, the
Mhm.
ACAA was amended, and ESAs are treated as regular pets. So
That's right.
if they allow you to travel with a pet, you have to follow those guidelines. So your ESA probably has to be able to fit in a carrier under the seat in front of you.
And you will be paying extra fees. That will certainly be an extra cost.
Hey
Yeah.
guys,
Yes.
this is Marissa. One last question about this. I know you have in there other species other than dogs, but to clarify, um, can the airlines or under the act, can they make any restrictions with regards to the breed of service dog?
Debbie, you want to handle it?
No, there can be no restriction for breed.
That's right.
I mean, even if it's a dog that people are worried about, like one of the
Sure.
bully breeds that people are sometimes worried about. If this is
Mhm.
a trained service animal, it must be allowed.
That's correct. Like
Thank
I
you for
said, though,
clarifying.
like I said, though, folks, there will be pushback, and you have to be willing to properly notify the airlines and talk to people to make sure that you're coming in with the dog. And if you happen to have a pit bull dog as a service animal, I would encourage you to let them know that so that, security people don't just by default tell you you're not coming in with that dog, because I can guarantee you it will happen. Does it violate the law? Yes, it does. Will you be catching your flight? No, you will not. So again, how practical do people want to be about this and try to follow the protocols, try to, bring everybody on the same page before you do this, the kind of traveling that you're going to do, when you board airplanes. And really the same applies if you're going to use Greyhound or, like the trains.
Amtrak,
Yeah, Amtrak.
thank you.
Okay. All right. So here are some tips that we've got. If
Awesome.
you ever go into an establishment and they ask you to leave with your service animal for whatever reason, please do leave. We don't want people to get into any kind of an altercation situation, circumstance where they may, wind up calling law enforcement for whatever reason. If you're asked to leave, just go ahead and leave. If
Debbie?
you, yes.
No, sorry. Just since you mentioned police, I wanted to kind of jump on that and mention that we get a lot of calls from people regarding the ADA and how they ended up calling the police because they were not allowed into a place because they have a service animal. And this could be a blind person with a perfectly legitimate guide dog with the proper harness, the white leash, you name it. Looks completely legitimate, you know. And yet maybe a buffet restaurant, for example, said, no, you're not coming in with your dog. This is a buffet restaurant and we cannot allow that. And they've called the police. And the problem that I want people to understand about calling the police when you're dealing with an ADA problem is that the police department has no obligation to enforce the civil rights of people with disabilities. Actually, they have no obligation to enforce the civil rights of anyone, not gender related, not not religiously related. So it doesn't matter what the protected category would be. Police officers have no obligation. I keep repeating myself because people sometimes don't understand that the task of a police officer is to protect, life and limb. It is to stop crimes, maybe issue citations depending on the circumstances. And so, they're not there to protect anybody's civil rights. And when people call them and say, I'm not being allowed to come in with my service dog, they call us up because they say the police officer abused them or they abused their authority. And they were told with a very ugly face, go away and don't come back. And that happens. And many people have sued police departments over the service animal issue when they went to a public place. So please keep that in mind, that calling a police officer will not necessarily resolve your problem. And I'll let Debbie take it from there.
If you feel that you've been discriminated against, you do have the right to file a complaint with the Department of Justice. And we've included a website here. It's doj.gov, and you can follow their instructions for filing a disability discrimination complaint. But we do recommend that you first try to resolve the issue directly with the establishment, if possible. So here's some resources. Here's a whole list of helpful resources. When you get our PowerPoint, I hope that you're able to click on these links. But there's a lot out there. This is only a fraction of what we have. And if you have additional questions that aren't answered by some of these resources that we have listed, you are more than welcome to contact us. We would be delighted to hear from you and to send you resources, talk about resources to the best of our knowledge. So now it's time to open up for questions. I think we have about 20 minutes, maybe a little more than 20 minutes. This is our contact information here. You can call us on our 800 line, 800-949-4232. You can find us on the web at southwestada.org. If we don't quite answer all your questions now, but let's take a crack at it. Marissa, what have you got for us?
Hi, okay. We've got some great questions that came in. I'm going to backtrack a little bit to what we just talked about here with regard to travel. This person is asking, what about cruise ships and service animals and or emotional support animals?
Good question, Debbie. You want to tackle it?
That's a really good question. Cruise ships would be covered under Title III and would be required to allow someone to accompany, have their service animal accompany them, although there might be parts of the ship that would restrict access. Like they couldn't bring the dog into the kitchen or into the, to swim in the swimming pool. That wouldn't be okay either. I don't believe that they would be required to allow an emotional support animal.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
ESAs will not be allowed, right, Debbie? They wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, it's only under the Fair Housing Act, which hotels and cruise ships do not fall under.
Now, we do know that they do allow pets on cruises. And of course, what that means, folks, is you'll be paying an extra fee for that.
Wait, there are cruises that allow pets?
Yeah, there are people who will take their dogs with them. But it's, they would have to follow all of their protocols, obviously. They'll even have dog relief areas. It's just that they'll have to follow the rules. And because they will be considered pets, they would not be emotional support. It would be just a pet. And that's kind of how that would work. So, they will have to pay whatever the extra fee is. And, but I'm not sure how they do it exactly. I know that it's obviously not every cruise that people can take. You have to call and research, which ones will allow you to come on board with your animal with you. So that's been known to happen.
Yeah, if I might add to that, Diego, just briefly, there might be some different stipulations too. For example, cruises or cruise lines traveling internationally. So
Oh yeah,
that's
absolutely.
something to consider.
Absolutely. They would not be allowed to, they will not be allowed to go into different country zones.
So
That will
maybe it's
not be
just
permissible.
Alaskan cruises.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Or
that's why I say that people need to find out ahead of time and get what the protocol is because they will be put through a protocol. I actually have heard of cases where people have gone to cruises to Europe with their dog, but they had to follow all of the proper vetting procedures to get the dog through customs and all that kind of stuff. So it, and they take that very seriously. I mean, you will not be allowed with your dog to cross the border unless you follow the protocols.
all right. So one last one with regard to travel. When traveling, does the service animal have to have a ticket if they are over a certain size? This is a
Ooh,
new
that's a
one
good
that
one.
we keep getting.
So we're talking about air
Uh,
travel, or are we
yeah,
talking about
yes, air travel. If a person's traveling on an airline, can the airline charge them essentially a fee if the dog is over a certain size?
are we talking about a service animal, or are we talking about an emotional support animal?
Service animal.
Service
No, I
animal.
don't think they can restrict in any way. I mean,
Well, if they take an extra seat, yes, they can charge you for the extra seat. I understand that that's been the case. I don't think that um, they're not considering a service animal like a personal care attendant. That was my understanding from something I read the last time. But we would have to check on this for people, David, because I'm not
yeah,
sure if the DOT may have changed how they feel about that but I do know that people traveling with personal care attendants that are absolutely essential for life, right? They're necessary. They have to be there. They can't charge for their seat. I do know that.
okay. But if we're talking about a
But
Great Dane,
I was going to
um,
say
yeah,
yeah, right.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a
sometimes.
space issue. Possibly, it might be impractical. I don't know. That is a DOT issue.
Well, my understanding in terms of bringing the dog on into the cabin is if you travel, coach, regular fare, is that they have to reserve and give you that front bulkhead seat where you have space at your feet to keep the dog there. You've probably seen that. But obviously, if those seats are taken by people already, especially in these first come, first served flights, folks, don't expect to be accommodated. They have to accommodate, the law says so, but I've been in many situations where the flight attendants have been completely unwilling and reluctant to move anybody out of their seat. And I think that this has been a latest trend in the last couple of years based on the fact that there have been so many altercations on air flights from people that get irate and lose their temper, um, where they literally get into fist fights over who gets to sit where and or who needs to get up and clear a seat. And so flight attendants regrettably have been influenced by all the negativity and basically they are very reluctant to move people out of the front seats, out of those seats with extra, you know, leg room. But in terms of using the extra seat, typically, I think you have to look at the fact that they can charge for that extra seat. Again, I think the exception is going to be for the personal care attendant.
Okay. Switching gears here a bit to fair housing. The person is asking, can my son have a service animal in a DLS home? I'm not sure what that stands for, forgive me. If his housemate is afraid of dogs. Oh, daily living skills.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
Apologies there. So, can my son have a service animal in a DLS home if his housemate is afraid of dogs?
Debbie,
Well,
you want to try it?
yes,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely. It may very
yeah,
well be that that we need a different roommate. They need
sure.
to accommodate that other person as well.
Hmm.
But service animals would be allowed there. Absolutely.
Yeah, and why would that be? Because it's likely that that special place we're talking about is either run by a private entity, which is a public accommodation covered by Title III, or it could be maybe even run by a state.
By the county. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by the county. So they're Title II covered. So yeah, they would have to accommodate.
Okay.
Now, the service animal does need to be completely under the control of the handler too. I don't know
Right.
if we're talking about a young child, that could complicate the situation. But if we're talking about an adult person who has complete control of their animal, then yes.
Hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so with regard to housing, severe allergies to animals, are these protected in a rental home? And for example, they're saying as a homeowner, I rent a room or a duplex side. So for rentals to individuals with service animals, if upkeep is not kept, um, do they still have an obligation to rent that out if the person has, or the person who owns the rental has a severe allergy to animals and they live on the property, it sounds like.
It's my understanding that under the Fair Housing Act, if the landlord lives in the same dwelling and rents out a portion of their dwelling, they are not required to allow a service dog if they don't want to.
That's right. Yeah. Now, if the landlord owns, is it 4 homes?
Yeah, four or more.
And
Mm-hmm.
right, 4 or more, then they would have to allow the service animal. Now, if the landlord, I think it's they can live in one of them, correct? Then they would have to
Right, but
allow,
not if they're
yeah.
living on the same one.
No,
They
not
don't
in the
have
same
to.
one, right?
Yeah,
So, but if they own multiple homes, like in different places, then they would have to allow those accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. That would be that would be correct. Now, oh, there's one exception that I almost forgot about, Debbie. A um, a landlord who advertises their home for rent, even if it's just half of the home. I don't know, like maybe what, a mother-in-law apartment or something like that. I don't want to get into people who just rent rooms out. That can be a really sticky situation, and we could talk about that for hours. And that gets litigated like every now and again. It'll get litigated and relitigated. It goes to courts, but if we're talking about renting, you know, and the landlord is advertising this on a one of those advertising apps, or they're using
like
a real estate,
Zillow.
right,
Airbnb.
Airbnb,
Yeah,
or they're using a real estate agent, then they have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So I want people to be clear on that, yeah, you could have a landlord that owns only one home that they rent out, as their little nest egg to get some money every month. Yep, they would have to accommodate under the Fair Housing Act because they are using those advertising services, which of course, advertise in the stream of commerce, right? Everybody gets to see, and you call, you say, I want to rent your home. So that's why they have to do that.
yeah,
Thank
Marissa, you
you.
mentioned Airbnb. So if we're talking about a short-term rental, like a vacation home or something, folks that do that are like members of Airbnb, subscribe to VRBO, apps like that. Those organizations have policies that state that, for the most part, they have to accept service animals.
Yeah.
There may be one or two of those organizations that allow some exceptions. Uh, so anybody that is thinking about renting out, a short-term rental, they need to look into those organizations and to find out whether or not they've got some flexibility about accepting animals or not, because some of them are pretty rigid and they say they must accept a service animal.
Yeah. And I want to point out that we can be very critical. Let me point out that the ADA centers, for everybody out there, the ADA centers are not advocates. We are not an advocacy organization like, say, the disability rights, um, um, um,
Texas or
protection and advocacy in your state. is an advocacy organization. They advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. They even file cases in court on behalf of people with disabilities. The ADA centers are strictly neutral. We are in the middle of the V, right? So-and-so versus so-and-so. We're in the middle of that. And so our job is to tell you what the law means. If it needs interpreting, we'll interpret it to the way that we understand it with as much supporting information as we can provide you with in terms of what our understanding on how the law applies. And so you can rest assured that when you call us, you're going to get a pretty straightforward answer about what the law says and what it doesn't say. If it's vague, we'll tell you so. It's vague. We're not really sure what the answer is. We'll tell you that, you know. A lot of times we answer, it depends. Debbie said that earlier, you know, it
A lot
depends.
of times. Yeah.
Yeah, what's going on, you know. But we will tell you that we can be very critical when people tell us facts. Obviously, we're not criticizing how people live, but when they tell us facts, for example, I'm renting a B&B, I don't want people bringing in dogs because of the dog hair, and I have to clean the carpets and, you know, such and such and such. You know, I am sitting there listening and I'm going, I'm sorry, what is the difference between that and people coming in to use the environment when they come and stay there? Because when you start thinking about it, there really isn't much difference, right? So we will ask these kinds of questions to make people think, you know, think critically about what they're thinking about. And we'll explain that, you know, once you've crossed that boundary into the stream of commerce and you're in commerce now, you're putting out your property to rent out to people to come and use it for the weekend or whatever. Yeah, you will be subject to all these civil rights laws that will apply.
Let me add another thing. You said that, you know, we're not advocates. We can't call anybody and tell them that they're, you know, not in compliance. We can only help people figure
Right,
out how to do that themselves. We also can't offer legal advice.
right,
So, you know, we may know a lot about the law. Some of us may actually be attorneys, but we can't tell someone what to do legally.
exactly.
And in
Right,
Oklahoma, it's the Oklahoma Disability Law Center that we would probably send you to for legal consultation.
right, right. Or a private attorney for that matter. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for clarifying. Um, Going back to fair housing, living in an apartment complex, the landlord requires a pet fee. I think we might have covered this already, but just to clarify, is the pet fee required for a service dog that is not an emotional support animal?
No.
And would it be required for an emotional support animal?
No.
Double-edged
No.
Uh,
sword here.
but
Right.
there is a
That's
process that people have to follow if they want their animal to be recognized as an emotional support animal. And
right.
we can, you know, if you want information about that, you can contact us and we can tell you about that process. But the individual would most likely be asked to provide documentation of their disability from a treatment provider
That's right.
stating that their animal is an emotional support animal. And at that point, the landlord can't charge a pet fee. But as we said earlier, should that animal cause any damage to the apartment, then the person would be liable for that.
Right. But they cannot charge any surcharges with regards to the actual accommodation, right, Debbie? That's what they
Right,
cannot charge.
right.
So, and that includes a pet deposit fee. They cannot charge the pet deposit fee because why not? Think about it. It's not a pet,
It's not a pet.
right?
It's an animal in service to someone's disability.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, by the way, there are no forms for people, just so that we don't confuse them. There are no forms to do this. There are no specialized forms of any kind from anybody. You might find some of them on the web, but believe me, they were created by a private entity typically. So just be careful with that. Some landlords, especially those who rent a lot of apartments, might have a specialized form for that. Just make sure that you answer the questions accordingly and that the questions are not overly intrusive, like, what kind of medications do you take or anything of that nature which would not be relevant to having ESA, in your apartment.
Okay. very quickly, going back to the issue of the short-term rentals, such as Airbnb or VRBO, they're asking for you to clarify. Can you clarify that applies to service animals? What about emotional support animals? Would it just be for service animals that there's an obligation to allow?
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct.
Because short-term rentals would be covered under Title III of the
Mhm.
ADA. They are not required to recognize emotional support animals. However, I think that there are plenty of these short-term rentals that do allow pets.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so yeah.
Well, and it's interesting. It, to get kind of technical about it, the idea here is that again, you're entering into commerce when you rent out your property. You're now in commerce, you're in business with the general public out there. And so once you do that, you open yourself up for all these different kinds of liabilities. Unfortunately, they're all there. You can't make them go away by saying, oh, I'm not going to allow any dogs. I won't allow any cats. I'm not going to allow any birds. You know, I'm not going to allow any children, older than 5 years old. In other words, you start violating all these laws that apply to housing, but at the same time, when you enter commerce, you're becoming basically a Title III public accommodation, kind of like a hotel. And remember, again, you're using a rental service, you're paying real estate agents, you're paying all these apps, which definitely charge fees for advertising on their platform. And so, that's what makes people subject. A lot of these folks regrettably do not understand these concepts. They don't get that. And I appreciate that, obviously one shouldn't have to go to business school to do anything like this, right? I mean, everybody needs a little bit of extra money, especially if you own an extra property someplace and you want to rent it out. Nothing wrong with that. It's great. That's commerce. But again, you're putting yourself out there. You kind of becoming a store and you're saying, "Hey, I have this place for rent, come and take a look at it."
Okay, one last question because we are just about out of time. I wanted to kind of throw a wrench into everything. Um, this person says, I'm an orientation and mobility specialist who works with clients who are blind and sometimes have guide dogs. There's a lot of confusion and problems I have heard of from clients who have been denied service by private drivers for companies like Uber
Hmm.
because the drivers believe they can deny service since it's a personally owned vehicle,
Sure.
especially due to cultural reasons regarding dislike of
Right.
dogs, etc.
Right.
Can you speak to this? Is there a recommendation for something that someone can do
You want
if
to try it,
this?
Debbie?
Well, I mean, this is Title III. I mean,
Yeah.
they have to allow a service animal. I mean, let's get real too. I mean, if you're allowing your vehicle to be used to transport the public, there's all kinds of nasty possibilities that could happen transporting
Absolutely.
people.
Yeah.
So, a well-trained service dog is likely to cause far less problem than some people. So I don't think there's any recourse. I think if you don't want to follow the law, then maybe you need to find something else to do.
Right. I mean, that's pretty much it. Now, obviously, these problems have occurred. This has gone to court. Uber has been sued multiple times in different states over the issue of people being, especially blind people with guide dogs being left behind because they had a dog. Essentially, these things get settled out of court typically. And what happens is, you have recourse, like we said earlier, file your complaint with the private entity that you have an issue with, right? If you can't get to the driver, then do it with the then do it with the entity itself. If it's Yellow Cab Company, if it's Uber, whoever it is, you file that complaint. And while they may not be able to correct that particular driver, right? you will get some kind of remedial, you know, agreement or settlement to help you, to remedy your the discrimination that you suffer. Let me put it that way. You're not going to become a millionaire doing that, so I wouldn't recommend doing it for that reason. But they do try to resolve these things privately as much as possible.
Okay. And we are at time. So I want to go ahead and close our presentation by thanking Debbie and Diego for a great presentation. We also want to thank again our hosts, the Department of Rehab Services for Oklahoma and the Oklahoma DD Council, especially Jennifer Randall for helping put all of this together. And thank you to our two interpreters, Hazel and Jerry. You guys are fabulous. And thanks to our audience for joining us today. You had such great questions, wonderful insights. And again, just a very quick reminder that this presentation has been recorded. So we will be providing that link to you all and to the folks at the DD Council so they can share it around, especially. And also the PowerPoint presentation for today. The slides will be sent to you. You'll get a link to that as well. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. This concludes our program. You may now exit your browser. Oh, and one final thing. If you do have questions that we did not get to today, shameless plug, you can give us a call on our toll-free line at 1-800-949-4232. And I will put that in the chat there. Or you can also send us an email at swdbtac@ilru.org. And all calls and emails are confidential, just FYI. All right. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Those of you in Texas, stay dry, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.